Good evening. We ended the last episode with Charlemagne descending victorious into Italy and laying siege to and conquering Pavia, the capital of the Longobard Federation of Italy, defeating King Desiderius. We will dedicate this episode to Charlemagne entirely, for he was a towering figure in the first millennium of the history of Italy. The pictures we have of him are those of an old man, but his biographer, called Eginard, says that he was dark, tall, handsome, with a shrill voice and a tendency to obesity. His favorite food items were garlic, onions, cabbage, and fava beans. But Eginard also tells us that one of his happiest days was when he discovered cheese, when a bishop invited him to breakfast on a Friday and served him with a slice of pecorino. But Charlemagne was abstemious, and though France is famous for her wines, he fought drunkenness. He always dined with his wife and children, while his confessor read passages from St. Augustine's City of God, some of which eventually he learned by heart. But later, rather than sleeping with his wife, he slept with one of the various mistresses who lived in his household. He was religious, but not a bigot. And though he was king of half Europe, he was often short of cash. To compensate for this, he raised chickens, which he sold along with their eggs. He had 3 official residences, though the preferred one was Aquisgrane, today Aachen in Austrasia, where in Aachen, he kept an elephant that was sent to him as a gift from the Caliph of Baghdad. Charlemagne was very fond of this elephant. He spoke to him and personally washed him, and perhaps it was through this excessive affection that Charlemagne caused the elephant to have an indigestion which killed it. Charlemagne was very saddened by the event and declared a day of mourning. He traveled extensively but very modestly, using an ox cart with limited baggage and staying with farmers or in convents. At times, he ruled and judged on local disputes depending on where his travels took him. And though he favored and promoted education among his subjects, he could never learn to write. After he dethroned Desiderius, the Longobard king, he did not colonize the Longobards, respected their customs and laws, kept their bureaucracy, and maintained the independence of some of their dukedoms. He assumed the title of King of the Franks and Longobards and became, along with the popes, one of the protagonists of the history of Italy. The pope he dealt with was Adrian, seen here in this miniature meeting with Charlemagne. Hadrian and Charlemagne kept an extensive correspondence, which gives us an interesting picture of the political landscape of the time. The gist of much of the correspondence has to do with the lamentations by the Pope, caused by the abuses of which the Pope thought himself a victim, abuses suffered from priests and bishops, as for example when the Archbishop of Ravenna abusively occupied 5 cities, including Bologna, on which the Archbishop thought he had a right. The Pope and Charlemagne corresponded in Latin, by the way. Then in 781 AD, Charlemagne, accompanied by his wife, Hildegard, and his 2 sons, who were 4 and 2 years old respectively, arrived in Rome on Easter Day. The official reason for the visit being the baptism of the older of the 2 sons. Carloman was his name. Then in 787 he crossed the Alps again, alone this time, as his beloved wife Hildegard had died the year before, and he replaced her with Estrade, or Estrade, said to be an irascible and petulant woman. Gossip says it that Charlemagne extended his stay in Italy longer than usual, so as to be away from the new wife as long as possible. While in Rome, Charlemagne became the arbiter of yet another dispute involving the ever-complaining Pope Adrian I. Charlemagne received a visit from a delegation from the Duchy of Benevento, the last remaining Longobard stronghold in Italy. Benevento's duke, but called Arecci, feared the territorial ambitions of the Pope on the south of Italy, who would use the Pope that is, would use the Franks as his military arm. The delegation filled Charlemagne with gifts, and he promised not to invade Benevento. However, no sooner the Longobards ambassadors left than the Pope called on Charlemagne, imploring him to invade the Duke of Benevento. Charlemagne agreed and quickly reached Capua, as you see on the map. Arricchi, the Duke, sent another delegation to negotiate, and this ended up with the Duke paying a handsome yearly tribute to Charlemagne and his son Romualdo and his daughter Adalgisa as hostages, and also agreeing on having the beards, the Duke, of having the beards of the Duchy's citizens shaved, as it was the rules with the Franks. At least so says the historian, though we are authorized to harbor some doubts, as Charlemagne himself is always portrayed with a thick beard. Charlemagne then returned to France, where soon later Romualdo, the Longobard male hostage, died. Being the heir of the Duchy of Benevento, the duchy itself almost fell into chaos. But then suddenly Charlemagne freed Romualdo, who returned in triumph to Benevento. To be unhappy at this development was Pope Adrian, who accused Charlemagne of having treated Romualdo, the new Duke of Benevento, better than St. Peter, meaning himself, Adrian I. Pope Adrian died in 795 and was replaced by a priest of the Vatican establishment called Leo III. He was eminently unpopular and bitterly fought against by the relatives of the previous Pope, Adrian I, who accused him of all sorts of infamies. The dispute went on for 4 years, at the end of which took place what in the novel is called the denouement, that is, the final part of the play or movie where the strands of the plot, so to speak, are drawn together and led to conclusion. This information, by the way, is extracted from the Liber Pontificalis, which is a book of biographies of popes from St. Peter until the 15th century. The account of what happened is extraordinary and, as we would say today, in this age which is politically correct and ethically corrupt, the views of the pontifical books do not reflect the views of the station. Anyway, as the Pope was leading a procession through Rome, he was assaulted by a band of noblemen led by 2 nephews of the previous Pope Adrian I, called Pascal and Campolo. Pope Leo was beaten and abandoned in the middle of the road, blinded and with his tongue cut out, and none of the brethren at the procession, armed only with flags and crosses, dared to defend him. Towards the evening, the assailants returned to the place of the assault and were surprised to find Pope Leo still alive, whereupon Pascal and Campolo cut another piece of the Pope's tongue and dragged him to a monastery not far away. But that very night, St. Peter appeared in a dream to the wounded Pope and gave him back his life, his sight and his voice. Next morning, Pope Leo managed to escape from his cell and was met by a group of his followers who loaded him onto a mule and brought him back safe and sound to St. Peter, from where he departed for the town of Spoleto. As I said, all this comes directly from the Liber Pontificalis. From Spoleto he began the long march to Paderborn in Saxony, where Charlemagne kept his summer residence. But Pascal and Campolo were not deterred by the miracle of the Pope's healing, which was a resurrection. They reiterated their accusations, and Charlemagne nominated a commission, as we would say today, a commission to inquire on the allegation and to determine if the Pope should be impeached, as also we would say today. The Pope lingered in Saxony for a few months, during which he held frequent meetings with Charlemagne, and according to some historians, during these meetings that Charlemagne asked the Pope if he would crown him as an emperor in exchange for dropping the charges that the enemies of the Pope had levied against him. These are speculations that, however, have a ring of truth, for in 799 AD, Charlemagne was master of Europe. His domain extended from the river Elbe to the Pyrenees and included all the land between northern Italy and the Northern Sea. It made sense that he, Charlemagne, should be recognized as the official ruler of the Western Empire, considering that the emperors of the Eastern Empire had not practically administered the Western lands for centuries. Leo then returned to Rome, and within a week the commission found the accusations against Pope Leo unfounded, as could be expected. Pascal and Campolo were dispatched to Charlemagne, who locked them up in a monastery. He then fixed the date for his coronation in Rome, and he arrived in Rome on the 24th of November in 800 AD, applauded by a crowd that the Pope had convened from all lands adjacent to Rome. Meanwhile, the day of the coronation was getting near, the 25th of December, when the Pope, in an elaborate ceremony, crowned the Emperor, at the end of the ceremony, left as gifts at the foot of the altar a silver tablet, a chalice, and a lid made of gold. But even then, there were quite different accounts of the same event. Eginhard, as I said, the official biographer, writes that Charlemagne would never have threaded into St. Peter's had he imagined the trick that the Pope had in mind for him. Whatever the case may be, Charlemagne lingered a few more months in Rome, then traveled to Pavia, where in Pavia he took possession of a chess set carved in ivory sent to him by the Caliph of Baghdad, Harun al-Rashid, the same one who sent him the elephant. On balance, whatever the actuality of the imperial title bestowed on Charlemagne may be, it had a very important weight on the history of Europe for more than 1,000 years. The Western Roman Empire lasted until the Emperor of Austria and Hungary abandoned the throne at the end of World War I, the first of two disastrous civil wars fought in Europe during, as you know, the 20th century. Charlemagne assumed the title of emperor when he had already unified the empire. The war against the Longobards had been a quick war, a blitzkrieg we would call it today. Instead, the war against the Saxons lasted 30 years. Saxony included a large extension of land from the North Sea to the Lower Rhine. Earlier Roman emperors had tried to conquer these lands without success. The Saxons were cruel, rough, and lived essentially through robbery and rapine. The river Rhine was the only barrier protecting the Franks from a Saxon invasion, and earlier on, King Pippin managed to reinforce the defense lines and even exact a small tribute from them. But in 772 AD, the Saxons refused to pay the tribute, which gave Charlemagne a good excuse to invade Saxony. He crossed the Rhine, proceeded to Arensberg, where he established his headquarters for the northern campaign. In the north, Charlemagne destroyed what was called the Irminsul, which was a sacred idol, sacred for the Saxon, that is, the Irminsul. The Saxons took revenge and burned the churches that Charlemagne had built in their territory. There followed a campaign and war of revenge as usual. This lasted until 104 AD, when all of Saxony was subjugated. In 777 AD, he convened an assembly of Saxons and Franks in Paderborn. Here, the Saxons swore that they would submit to the Franks and would convert to Christianity. Charlemagne conducted a mass baptism, and by so doing, he was effectively making them subject to the Frankish Empire. But the Saxons were not finished. The emblem of the resistance was their leader, by the name of Widukind, a master in what we call today guerrilla war. And knowing that Charlemagne was often absent due to his travels in other parts of the empire. The Frankish army was loyal to Charlemagne, but peace was rarely a steady property of an empire that contained distinct peoples, each with a mind of their own, as we would say today. While the Franks fought the Slavs further east, Widukind organized the resistance, and when the Franks returned from the east, they fell into a trap and were badly defeated at a place called Suntel, which is a mountainous formation in the German central uplands. This time Charlemagne's vengeance was deadly. 4,500 Saxon hostages were massacred at Werden am den Aller. Widukind retreated to what is today Denmark. He tried to reorganize and fight back, but eventually gave up and converted to Christianity, as is shown in this miniature. A statue called De Partibus Saxoniae established that the death penalty would apply for any act of rebellion, any resistance to the conversion efforts of the clergy, and any return to paganism. Charlemagne transformed Saxony into a large Frankish prefecture, as we call it today, divided into counties, and each one having a count as a leader with both administrative and judicial power. Nevertheless, the pacification of Saxony proved hard and difficult. In 793, again there was another rebellion, at which point Charlemagne took a drastic measure. He deported into Austrasia and Neustria thousands of Saxon families, and in their place he deported about the same number of French families. There was a procedure done in the old Soviet Union as well. The last deportation occurred in 804 AD, but by that time Saxony was already well incorporated into the Frankish Empire, being its more important satellite, and we could say the embryo of modern Germany. No one can predict the upheavals of history. Later on, the empire of Charlemagne was divided among his heirs into 3 districts, the middle of which was called Lotharingia, the most vulnerable of the 3. In what turned out to be the real First World War in 1215, Lotharingia came close to being eliminated, and if the French king had not won, today there would be no France and no French language. Those interested may look at episode number 8 of the series called The Battle of Bouvines. But keeping an empire united is no easy task. After the insurrection in Saxony, Charlemagne had to deal with Bavaria, which had been raised to the level of a duchy by Pippin, who in turn gave Bavaria to a nephew named Tassilo. Tassilo had an army, a tax collection system for his own exclusive benefit, a mint, and handled his foreign affairs in total independence from Charlemagne. In 782, Charlemagne summoned Tassilo to Worms and obliged him to renew his oath of fidelity, requesting 12 hostages as a pledge. In the meantime, rumors circulated that Tassilo had a secret association with Adelchi, the son of the Longobards king Desiderius, defeated at Pavia, as we saw in the previous episode. Tassilo attempted to engage Pope Adrian I as his ally, but the attempt failed. Eventually, Tassilo was taken prisoner, ending up his life in a monastery. Just like Saxony, Bavaria was divided into counties and became a Frankish province. To the east of the barbarians, which by the way is why Bavaria is called Bavaria, were the Avars, a people of Turkish Mongolian origin, cousins of the Huns, who reached Europe through Russia and settled in Pannonia, as you see on the map. Their capital, if we can call it capital, was a fortified camp constituted by 9 concentric fortified walls called appropriately the Ring. At the center there was the tent of the Khan, who was chosen among the leaders of the various clans. The Avars did not practice agriculture or trade. They exclusively lived by robbery and rapine, and their favorite targets were convents and churches. They stored the loot in the innermost wall of the Ring and constituted a serious menace for Charlemagne and for the Western Empire, understandably. At first, Charlemagne proposed a non-aggression pact, but the Khan refused and caused several incidents at the frontier. Charlemagne then declared war, entered Pannonia, and the Avari were literally eliminated from history. Had they not, we would have today, besides Bavaria, we would have Avaria, and you can imagine the verbal confusion that would follow. But among Charlemagne's successes there were also failures. Earlier on we saw how the Frankish king Charles Martel stopped the advance of the Moors at Poitiers in 732 AD. But the Muslims were the dominant force in what is today Spain, then called Andalus. Charlemagne did not consider Spain as his patio trasero, the back porch, the equivalent before his time of the sometimes poorly quoted Monroe Doctrine, that is, regarding South America. Nevertheless, the Moors remained a constant threat just behind the Pyrenees, and an occasion to intervene presented itself to Charlemagne literally without him looking for it. Of all the military campaigns that Charlemagne conducted, the one that went badly is the most well known, enhanced by a vast literary and poetical production that actually extended centuries behind the event. The story begins in Paderborn, one of Charlemagne's governmental residences, where he had built a castle. There, in Paderborn, a delegation of Arab chiefs showed up, and they were in disagreement with the Emir of Cordoba. Therefore, they asked Charlemagne's intervention against the Emir of Cordoba, and in exchange they would recognize Charlemagne as their king. Charlemagne liked the idea, and he gathered his forces at Cassel in the southwest of France in 778 AD, and divided the forces into two armies. One was to move towards Barcelona, and the other, under his direct command, attacked what is today Pamplona in modern Spain. Meanwhile, his ally, the Moor governor of Barcelona, called Soliman ben al-Arabi, defeated the forces of the Emir of Cordoba under the wall of Saragossa. Charlemagne perhaps already dreamt of a Spain reconverted to Christianity, but there was treason among the troops of the governor of Barcelona, the victor of Saragossa. Suddenly, a squadron of the Arab cavalry revolted and made an ambush. Taken by surprise, the Franks did not have time to gather themselves in a battle formation and had to retreat towards the Pyrenees as fast as possible. Waiting for them, the Franks, that is, among the steep and rugged gorges of the Pyrenees, were the Basques, fiercely independent then as they have been until our times. Their tactics were essentially a guerrilla war, which they used to effect in attacking the rear guard of Charlemagne's army as it passed through the gorge of Roncevaux. Legend, as I said, has magnified the importance of the defeat, considering that among the fallen was Roland, one of the most loyal vassals of Charlemagne. Another important victim was the governor of Brittany, the Seneschal Aiguillard, where seneschal is a term that remained in the vocabulary of the nobility in France and England as the higher representative of the king when the king is absent. The massacre at Roncevaux gave rise to the famous Chanson de Roland, which also gave origin to a literary genre, an epic narrative called Chanson de Geste, that we can translate epics of a noble act. In the Chanson de Roland, the proud paladin only sounds the alarm with his hunter's horn, called Oliphant, after sowing death among the enemy, thanks to his sword called Durandal. This was the equivalent of what today would be the version of CNN. In reality, Charlemagne never crossed the Pyrenees again, but left his Duke Guillaume de Toulouse, to guard the southern frontier that was subject to these incursions. But King Guillaume, that is, took a dazzling revenge by launching a punitive expedition in Muslim or Saracen territory, after which there was established the Mark of Spain, La Marche d'Espagne, where marche or mark refers to a feud located in border territories, behind the walls and fortifications built by Guillaume himself. In time, this mark of Spain would become the base of the future Reconquista, of Spain by the Christians later on. In 806 AD, Charlemagne convoked a large assembly of noblemen and clergy and divided the empire among his sons. To Pippin went Aquitaine and Italy, to Louis a large part of Bavaria and the part of Germany below the river Danube, and to Charles his favorite Neustria, Austrasia, a part of Bavaria and Thuringia. But Pippin and Charles died young. There remained only Louis, whom in 813 Charlemagne associated to the throne. For the last few years Charlemagne had been in poor health. After he died, the prognosticators after the fact found that several unusual prodigies had somehow predicted his death at the age of 71. Charlemagne's death was the beginning of the end of the Western Roman Empire as a Carolingian empire. Louis, his successor, proved a disaster. He was a bigot, but he was also cruel. His subject called him Pius, Louis the Pious, for religious zeal. However, notwithstanding this, he ordered the eyes extracted from his nephew Bernard, the son of Pippin, for having taken over Italy from his father without authorization. There were internecine battles between the successive heirs of the empire, and eventually, with the Treaty of Verdun in 843, the empire was divided into three, one of which went through Lothair and was called Lotharingia, from which, as I said, derives the name of the famous region of Lorraine. Lorraine became an item of contention and gave rise to the actual First World War in 1215. The three real protagonists of the Carolingian family, we could say, were Charles Martel, the one of Poitiers, Pippin and Charlemagne. But during the 100 years of that reign, Europe had changed its physiognomy. Europe had lost, we could say, its Roman imprint and acquired a new German imprint. Next time, we will discuss the influence of the Arabs in Europe and Italy, for they had been stopped at Poitiers militarily, but they had an important role in the molding of post-Roman Europe and post-Roman, post-Carolingian Italy. Thank you for watching, and until next time, I am Jimmy Moglia for Historical Sketches. Good night.